Hello and welcome to my senior thesis presentation. My name is Andrew Thompson, and today I'm going to be discussing my senior thesis paper, which is titled A Behavioral Economic Analysis of the 2020 Election. So, in the abstract, the 2020 election is one of the most significant events of this year. Millions of Americans went to the polls just under a month ago, and yet it was dwarfed by an even more major world event, the 2019, now 2020, and depending when you're listening to this, maybe 2021, COVID-19 pandemic. And in a vacuum, voting should be almost unaffected by something like the COVID-19 pandemic, besides, obviously, the emergence of it as a major voting issue. But I'm looking into the actual act of voting itself, as millions of Americans cast their ballots from home as a precaution to exposure to COVID-19. Not only are they spending more time at home and voting from home potentially, but that time at home also may have an impact on their vote. And there's a lot of conceptions on what people value in voting, and political scientists have filled books and books and books on why people vote, what people should consider when they vote. And we know partisanship, ideas, values, and sometimes even who comes off the best on TV impact a lot on people voting. But what's critical, and what's something that's not considered as much, is the environment that people vote in has an important factor to the results of that vote. So that's what I'm going to be looking into more today. And this key concept of analyzing how people are impacted and understanding why these decisions are changed in different environments. And I'm going to be discussing a lot of work about two behavioral economists, Kahneman and Tversky, who contributed a lot. And in these contributions, they've discovered topics like loss aversion, framing, and priming. These are all things I'm going to go into later. And it's critical, though, is that a lot of the behavioral economic analysis and research has barely towed into issues like voting. And a lot of the political science research hasn't really gone into considerations about behavioral economics. So I'm trying to take these two fields and merge them into one approach so that I can more effectively analyze how behavioral economics impacted the 2020 election. So I'm going to walk through my literature review and specifically what behavioral economics means. I'm going to move through the eventual historical analysis and how I set up my experiment. And then I'm going to show the numbers of the experiment, the values and the calculations that I did to find my results, which I will walk through, explain, and eventually I'll even go into some reservations and the limitations of the data. So to understand how voters may be impacted by their environment, it's really important to understand what behavioral economics is. So it's one of the more recent fields in economics, and economics itself is an absolute gargantuan field. There's a lot of moving factors and there's a lot of subfields, and this is one of the newest ones. So one important keystone to the topic of behavioral economics is the idea of irrationality in people. So in writings on rationality, especially through or by Kahneman, it focuses on the bias of people between two systems, and which he labels System 1 and System 2. And these are what would be easily thought of as what's going on in people's head. So System 1 is really easy to understand. It's normally considered your intuition. One example I give is when you're walking through a corn maze and someone dressed as a werewolf jumps out, System 1 tells you to run. System 2 is more deliberative. It's slower. It requires energy to use. And while System 1 can ride a bike, System 2 is employed to help write an essay. And the entire idea of irrationality is based on the normal economic idea of Homo economicus. So classical economics uses Homo economicus to represent what a person is. And they do calculations based on this, and I'm not going to get too far into it today. Essentially, what it is a simplification of people, theorized as something that's unanswerably rational, completely selfish, and can effortlessly solve the most difficult optimization problems. Now, if that doesn't sound like you, don't worry, it's not a real person, and it's mostly used as a stand-in. But what behavioral economics does is it looks at that creation and says, okay, well, I don't really know anyone like that. I've never met anyone like that. How can we possibly get a good understanding of the world when we're doing calculations based on this made-up person? So, behavioral economics delves into the ideas of people being irrational. And one of the first ideas in this field put forward by Kahneman and Tversky was the idea of risk aversion. So, stated simply, a person is risk averse when they accept, this is one example involving gambling. So if you would accept $450 and instead of taking a 50-50 chance to win $1,000 or $0, because $450 is less than the average of the 50-50, which should be $500. Now, it makes sense, right, as a person. The $450 is guaranteed. By taking a chance, you might end up with nothing. But Homo economicus would always take the 50-50, because that is the most likely outcome of generating the most money. Now, that's not exactly a perfect representation, as some risky people would frequently take the 50-50, but overall, the sure option is the most popular in studies. So another example involving an actual study is a sure $100 or a coin flip to receive 200 and 0. Usually that would be exactly 50-50 in a normal study, because the outcome is always $100 on average. However, the most exciting or the most popular outcome by far at 72% is the sure $100, and part of that is because people are risk averse. In the flip side, when it comes to losing $100 for sure, or losing $0 or $200, people are risk-taking because people do not like to lose things. And this is something that would never happen with the Homo economicus. And that's exactly what it is. And there's some voting studies even involving people liking some candidates more based on candidates in the field. If the Homo economicus was involved in voting, it only cares about which candidate it's most interested in, and it doesn't matter if one person or another person is additionally in the field. Similarly, we've even found out through behavioral economic studies that people vote differently based on environments. Specifically, the environment we test, or that's been tested by Kahneman, was schools. People vote differently while they're in schools, and they vote more likely to increase funding of schools when they're voting in schools. And this effect actually can be replicated just by putting up pro-school posters and that sort of thing. And this is a great example of people being sensitive to their environments, even if those environments are shifted slightly with the inclusion of posters. So, and that brings us a little bit of base, a little bit of knowledge of how I'm going to be looking at how people's behaviors might be changed. Now, the next part I'm going to be talking about is the historical narrative of how I conducted my experiment. And I did analysis of Oregon and Washington, and I'm going to walk through why I made this decision. So, Oregon is very similar to Washington in a lot of ways. They're right next to each other, they have similar demographics, similar populations, and a lot of those borders between them are made pretty arbitrarily. But Oregon is unique inside the entire country. Oregon is the only state that only allows voting to be conducted by mail, meaning 100% of the ballots cast every year are done through mail. And that's very different from how Washington does. So Washington, especially in the last few decades, has been increasing their amounts of voting by mail, but is nowhere close to the 100% mandate of mail-in voting. And I'm going to be looking at two presidential elections in Oregon and Washington. And these are the 1996 and the 2000 election. And these elections are important because it was right before the 2000 election that vote only by mail was set up in Oregon. And before that, it was much more similar to Washington in the 1996 presidential election. There was high rates or increasing rates of vote by mail, but there's no mandate and it was not near 100%. By isolating this certain year, I'm trying to isolate any effects of an increase in vote by mail. And the reason I'm doing this is because I'm trying to most closely mirror the expected increase in vote by mail from the 2016 election to the 2020 election. And while there is some concern that the increase in vote by mail in Oregon was from 50% to 100%, obviously in 2020 there's no guarantee of being 100% vote by mail. We know that now approaching and conducting the election. But it is important to note that we might increase nationally from the same amount. So even if it's from 20% to 70%, the numbers haven't been released when I was conducting my paper. So unfortunately, there's no post-mortem to look back on. If this was done a year from now, then I might be able to check to see if I was more accurate, but it was more of a theoretical prediction paper. So that kind of explains how I'm going to be looking at this. And it is important to note, though, that while Oregon does have 100% voting starting in 2000, they did have a strong history beforehand. So in 1996, there was around 50% mail-in voting. Of course, that is similar to Washington's for the time, so the differences are not as important. And the way I did this is, the way I calculated my results is through a data analysis project. So I've compiled all the Republican vote shares for both the county level and state level data in all of Oregon and all of Washington. However, there are some issues, and one of the biggest issues I ran into was what I called the Portland problem. And basically the issue with this is that a big city or the largest city in both of the states doesn't look anything like the rest of the state. A lot of Oregon and a lot of Washington has extremely low population density. It's extremely rural, and Portland, in contrast, is highly urbanized and has highly different demographics. So when I'm comparing state to state, it blurs the lines a lot when you include Portland. Now, there is some advantage, or there is some equalizing, as there is a large city in Washington. However, as you'll see, it's nowhere near the size of Portland. Just to put in some context, Portland's county is about 15 times the average county size in population density, whereas the largest city in Washington is only about 5 times the size of the average population density by county. So while it is much larger, it is not nearly the magnitude of largeness. So something I did to consider that is to have two data sets. So the statewide data set and also the border county data set. So the border county data set is actually beneficial because it excludes the largest, but also excludes the farthest away. So there is some consideration or some concerns when I'm comparing northern Washington and southern Oregon when they're really far apart. When you get farther apart, populations tend to be less similar, and by analyzing the two closest borders of the state, it means that the populations are more likely to be similar. Usually, as I mentioned, these political divisions or the political lines between the two states isn't necessarily matching, and frequently doesn't match population groups, especially when one border county next to Oregon and Washington looks pretty much the same as one across to the other side of the line. So I also had a data set analyzing the border counties. So there were still some issues inside the data set. So besides these two divisions I created, I also created a special set that only included the common range between them, the range of common support. The range of common support means that, and here's my example right here, that basically the smallest, or the county with the lowest population density in Oregon is 0.8 people per square mile, almost no one. While in the largest, it's 1,517.6, almost an additional 1,500 people, actually a little more than that. To compare those, of course, is extremely hard to do, so I simply, as I mentioned, the border county, we won't even be getting close to that. In Washington, on the other hand, things are a little bit more close, not by much, but the smallest county is 3.3 people per square mile versus 585.6 people per square mile. Not quite to the extent, but still a fair difference. So when I only include the counties of common support, that means cutting off all of the bottom of Oregon up to 3.3, which is the smallest county in Washington, and then cutting off everything in Oregon over 585.6, which is the largest county in Washington. That way, the range of new data I have now only includes counties with a similar range of border data. And of course, there's a little bit of differences between them, but including more data is extremely beneficial for the analysis. So, and I'm going to run through the numbers a little bit of my conclusions. So originally, when considering only the border counties, there's a 3.3 shift in the Democratic direction from the 1996 election to the 2000 election in Oregon. Unclear if it's due exclusively to increase in mail-in voting, but there is a sizable Democratic increase. When I only include counties of common support on the borders, then it shrinks slightly to only 3.3 percentage points increase. But doing so is even more important because it makes the data much more robust and a lot more reliable. Now, moving on a little bit, I'm gonna attach the table with all the results as well, so that everyone can look at all the table, or so can look at all the data, and you can look a little bit for yourself. But importantly, the shift exists no matter what, and it's important to note that all the data on the table is actually the Republican vote share, and that's why it says vote R, and the point shift is a negative, which means it's an increase in Democratic vote share. And all of this data actually includes the Republican and the third-party candidate, because there is a strong competitive third-party candidate, the strongest actually in the last 25 years. But it was a conservative. It basically came out of the Republicans wholesale, and the Democratic numbers year to year didn't really shift between that. And you can see that largely in the Republican voter data. So now we're thinking about conclusions. And importantly, the conclusions, it would appear that there was a large Democratic shift. There's a lot of possible justifications for that. People are more confident at home. Maybe people were feeling more giving for being at home. It's unclear exactly why, but it is clear that when there was an increase at people voting from home, there was also a requisite increase in people voting for Democrats, around 3.3%. And even though this is pretty strong results, even if there is some other third or other variable that it's impossible for us to see here, even a 1% shift is a large one, especially when you're dealing with hyperpolarized demographics and hyperpolarized voting patterns. And specifically, though, there is some limitations. And this is going to put a little asterisk on all these really strong conclusions. So one, vote histories in states with unique populations is risky. In Oregon, they are unique. They have no other state has adopted a vote only by mail system. Oregon is extremely unique. Of course, Oregon and Washington are both largely Democratic strongholds. They're not really up for flip, or they don't flip very frequently, and they almost never, and they haven't in a long time, in the last number of years, especially in presidential elections. Of course, comparing them to each other helps a little bit because they're similar, as I mentioned before, but Oregon's unique at the end of the day. While that allows it to be analyzed more effectively, it also means that these conclusions, especially the stronger conclusions, maybe are hard to consider as well. Also important to note, the data is 20 years old. I had to analyze the 1996 election and the 2000 election. It's 2020. That means 20 plus years have now passed since the collection of this data. That makes it slightly less reliable for predictive means. A lot of things change in 20 years. A lot of things change in politics in 20 years. Like I mentioned, the last third-party candidate was this year, and there's basically been no strong third-party contender in my lifetime, and I'm 20 years old. Also, it's important to note there is a global pandemic. The existence of the global pandemic allows us to do this kind of analysis, but also we're basically guessing the dark with how a pandemic could affect voting in other ways. Of course, there's other factors. People might vote differently based on the pandemic. We're seeing some numbers come in right now that reflect that possibility, but it's unclear. And maybe 50 years from now, there's going to be a billion books written about it, and we can look back and say that it didn't really matter, or people voted differently, but it was because they stayed at home, because they voted from home. Or maybe we'll find out in 50 years that although there was an increase at voting by mail, people filled out their ballots at the supermarket more often, and that impacted their vote. Or maybe it didn't impact their vote. There's a lot of other possibilities, is what I'm trying to say. Since it's clear, though, but vote by mail does have political impacts, we also have to talk and note the policy implications. If we're going to take seriously the idea that there's a 3.3 or even a 1 point shift in Democratic support, an increase in Democratic support because of mail-in voting, that's a lot. It's going to politicize, or it has the potential at least to politicize what has largely been a bipartisan issue. And that's potential increased. We're finishing this up in December of 2020. Anything could happen now, especially if there's contested election results. So it definitely increases that potential. It's also important to note that further research, because of this, is going to be really important. Mail-in voting has been only increasing so far in the U.S. If that gets slowed down, then that might be a big deal. But also, it's important to note that throughout my literature review, I also noted that there were some things that were not the likely results. So while there is increased voting by mail, we know that that does not clearly support Democratic candidates across the board. Sometimes those things correspond, as we saw in 2000, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to help Democratic candidates. We also know that voting by mail increases don't really change the demographics who vote, and it doesn't really bring in larger amounts of people. But when even looking at elections that have larger amounts of people, it's not explicitly clear that that affects Democrats. There's a lot of data and a lot of history behind Republican candidates being elected in high outcome years, and there's lots of Democrats who are elected in low salience years. The most serious effect that we can find where mail-in voting increases the actual share of votes are in low salience local elections. That is the exact opposite of what we're going to see, or what we just saw in 2020. This has been an extremely high salience, high stakes election, but also there's been a historically unpopular incumbent in the office. Incumbents rarely lose. The question is, if they're historically popular, does that change that? The answer seems like maybe at the point. We're also during a pandemic, so these are all variables that make it hard to predict what's going to happen. But we can still look at this 3.3% result and say pretty comfortably that probably Democrats will receive some boost if it turns out there's a significant increase in mail-in voting, which there does seem like there is. Looking at the election results right now, it seems like that's come true to some extent. I think the current amount of increase from the 2016 elections is about 3.8%. That's pretty close to our results. Of course, it's pretty foolish to say that, wow, we nailed it, we got the exact rate, but some of that, 1% of that, 2% of that, certainly could have been a result of people voting from home more often. At this point, it's more important to consider that mail-in voting does increase Democratic share because people are voting from home. More research is definitely needed on the topic, is what this shows. It's also important to consider, though, that if this increases Democratic vote share, what does that mean? Is that something that we should be doing? That's definitely limited by one topic in behavioral economics that I wrote about pretty extensively, called choice architecture. Choice architecture is basically the study of, do people's choices change when we move stuff around? A great example is grocery stores. People buy stuff at eye level much more frequently. Usually it's just because they can see it easier. Choice architecture is the study and consideration of, based on how we know that people buy things more frequently, what do? Should we put everything at eye level? Should we put healthy food at eye level? It's a huge responsibility to have to consider that kind of thing, because it's easy to favor people's health. It's also easy to favor profit. It's easy, with this sort of data, it's easy to consider maybe we should be increasing Democratic vote share. It helps more people vote. That's definitely not going to be a popular position in the Republican Party. If I was a Republican strategist and I read this and I took it more seriously, I would be doing the opposite thing. I don't know if that's exactly the stance I would take. I'm not a political strategist, but the data definitely has some bearing, and it's definitely going to ask us strong questions about what we should be looking at in voting and what sort of thing we should be prioritizing. So that's kind of my senior thesis. If you want to understand more, if you have more questions, my email is always open, and my paper is available for anyone who wants to read it. But I think that's going to wrap it up, and I hope that there's more research into this topic, as it seems like it's going to be really important going forward in the future and determining the future of increases in at-home voting and voting by mail.